course has been about NLP with respect to text, but we want to say some things to you about speech, because it's sort of similar, but not really, okay? And we want to be aware, or you to be aware of what the differences are between dealing with audio for language rather than text for language, okay? As you're probably aware, speech is pretty common amongst humans. They do it all the time. They learn to speak way before they learn to read and write, okay? I don't know, maybe the kids now are sending Twitter messages before they're 2 years old, and so they're doing it before they can speak. But for the most part, people are speaking more than they're writing, okay? Speech, however, is not recorded as much as what writing is. Sort of writing by definition gets recorded, but speech doesn't. And so I want to talk about some of the aspects about how speech works from a human point of view, and also how might we start to deal with it if we're wanting to do things with speech rather than language. There is overlap with what we've been doing, but I want to be able to make sure that you understand what some of these things are, okay? There are 4 key speech technologies that I want to talk about. I want to talk about speech recognition, so I'd like to take audio coming out of my mouth, and I'd like to give you a transcript, an actual written form of all the words that I'm saying. I'd like to do speech synthesis, so I'd like to be able to have text, and I'd like it to be rendered as speech so that it sounds like me speaking or whoever it's supposed to sound like speaking. I want to talk about dialogue systems, and these are basically things that they're using speech input and speech output, and they have to do stuff with it. This is what Siri and all our friends actually are. And there are some other speech processing things like speaker ID, recognizing things that are not in the words that people are saying, but how they're actually saying things. Okay. We generate speech by blowing air through lumps of meat, okay? It's not meats that you go and get from Giant Eagle, it's meat that's in your mouth, okay? And so we are blowing air through our lungs, through our thing called our larynx, which can vibrate when I go things like, ah, but also cannot vibrate, and I can blow air through it when I'm saying things like, shh. Okay, there's no vibration going on. That's a distinction between voice speech and unvoiced speech. What we have is from our larynx to our lips is we effectively have a tube, okay? And depending on how we interfere with that tube, we can get different resonant frequencies running through our vocal tract, as it's called. Okay, so if we're doing things like vowels and saying things like ah or e, what we're getting is different resonant frequencies going through that tube. Now, we can do things to that tube. We can put our tongue in the way. We can open up the back of our throat where there's a thing called the velum that opens to the nasal passage, and you get 2 tubes, your nose and your mouth, and so you get nasalized things like n and but also, although we don't do this in English, you can get nasalized vowels like ong, which you get in French, for example, or lots of other languages. In fact, it's relatively common. So what we're doing is we're blowing air through our vocal tract. We're modifying our vocal tract in order to make different types of noises. And over time, we've learned to be able to distinguish these different noises and eventually understand how these noises end up having some meaning, words, okay? What happens at the other end? Well, we have a completely different system that does the hearing. We have our ears, okay? And inside our ears, there's an eardrum, a little bit of skin that is pulled tightly across an open area. At the other side, there's a little bone inside it that just touches the eardrum. And when I speak, what's happening is I'm vibrating the air, okay? And it goes out all around the room, bounces off the walls, and eventually gets to your ears, okay? Maybe by multiple routes. And inside your eardrum vibrates at the frequencies that I'm actually generating with my speech, okay? The eardrum is a bit like a microphone. Well, it's the other way around. The microphone is a bit like an ear, okay? Because we had ears long before we had microphones. But the vibrations are actually happening, and what's happening inside is that little bone behind your eardrum is vibrating. In fact, it amplifies the sound a little bit, and it goes into this rather wonderful organ in your ear called the cochlea. The cochlea is a spiral thing that's full of fluid, okay? And what happens when you vibrate the bottom end of it, different places in that spiral will vibrate depending on the frequency that the original bone is vibrating. And in fact, much more importantly, what's happening is if you get a compound sound coming in with multiple frequencies, these frequencies get separated out of different places within the spiral inside your head, and effectively you get what's called a Fourier transform. You get the component frequencies of the noise. So if you're talking about vowels, and E fundamentally have two different frequencies in them. With they're two relatively low ones, and E, they're two relatively separated ones. And what happens in your ear is different parts of that spiral get excited by the decomposition of the frequency that's going on. It's pretty cool, okay? Now, occasionally, there's a relatively common disability where that cochlea has no fluid in it at all, okay? Usually congenital, so kids can be born with no fluid in there, and that makes you profoundly deaf, in the sense that you cannot distinguish sounds. You can see your skin and the rest of your body can still feel vibration, but fundamentally you don't hear sounds. About 20, 30 years ago, one of the things that we did in speech technology, and it's very much speech technology, these people go to the speech technology conferences, they discovered that what they could do is they could bypass the cochlea, and what they would do is they would excite the audio nerve at the other side, and they would have a small microphone do a little bit of signal processing and try to excite the audio nerve in the same way that the cochlea does. And if they did this for pre-vocal kids younger than 18 months, children could learn to hear. And although they were not hear as clearly as fully hearing children, they could basically develop normally. They could listen to speech, understand speech. They were still a little hard of hearing, but they could actually develop normally. And that's a pretty big thing that speech technology has done, basically creating artificial cochlea. Okay? Nowadays, they can do it actually for older people, so not just pre-vocal kids. And if you want to shed a tear, you should actually look at some of the YouTube videos of people having their hearing switched on when they've maybe lost it due to disease and not been able to hear for many, many, many years. And then suddenly there's a little switch and you can hear again, which is pretty cool. Of course, you then have to worry about battery and being able to plug in and carrying your charger all the time, but hey, you guys worry about that with your phone because you think that your phone is attached to your brain. Your phone is not attached to your brain, but you'll probably think that it is, okay? So, we have these noises that we can generate, and we have these noises that we can distinguish with our ears. How did we get from there to getting to speech, understandable, so that we can explain important things like, look out, there's a lion coming, versus explaining what we thought of the last season of Game of Thrones, you know, important things, okay? So how did we go about doing that? Well, what happened is, after a while, we decided that there are certain noises that we can distinguish, and we would consider these noises to be different sounds to such an extent that we end up treating them as being different units in the speech space. If you think about letters in the text space, we can talk about some segment of noise in the audio space that we consider to be, if you change that, you can get a different word. These are defined as what are called phonemes. Phonemes are linguistic units. They're not actually audio units. So how people render particular phonemes can be quite different. They can overlap. But the definition of a phoneme is if you change it, you can change the word to another word. So for example, okay, b versus p, okay, b versus p. okay, unvoiced, are different phonemes in English. It's going to vary from language to language. So bat, the thing you use on a baseball field. Sorry, I was about to say a cricket match, but you know what I mean. A bat, or the thing that flies and bites your neck and turns you into a vampire, versus pat, P-A-T, okay, which you do to a dog, okay. The b and the p, okay, are considered to be different, okay. If any of you out there are Arabic speakers, you probably just heard me say a bunch of nonsense because I just said the same thing again and again. And how on earth are these actually different? It's not unusual in some languages that people have different distinctions about different phonemes, and Arabic speakers don't distinguish between b and p. And that's true for some other languages, but that's one of the larger languages that are like that. The vowel space is when you have your mouth open and you're generating these vowels, A, E, O, and U. Different languages have got different distributions of those, but they're all made up of fundamentally two frequencies. They're often called ferments, and how these are joined together allow us to be able to generate different vowels and recognize different vowels. It's a continuous space, okay? It's not actually a bunch of discrete noises that we make, and different languages partition that in different ways. So if you've ever had to learn a different language and somebody says, you say this is this rather than that, and you think, yeah, they sound exactly the same to me, and that's because you have to learn the other language. You have to learn what these distinctions are. And I'm going to show you some examples for even the monolingual Americans in the audience, if we have any, where I show things that Americans do not distinguish, by many other English speakers do distinguish. Here are the vowels for American English in a particular alphabet that gets used often for speech recognition, called DARPAbet. Okay, these are not my vowels. Okay, Scottish English does not have the same distribution as what these vowels actually are, although maybe I've been here long enough to at least copy some of them. I'm going to talk about the last two. Okay, so we've got F-U-L-L and F-O-O-L. Do we have somebody who went to middle school in the US to read out these two words?
Full and full.
Okay, sorry, again?
Full and full.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
Here in Pittsburgh.
Yes. Okay. Do we have somebody who went to middle school not in Pittsburgh? Thank you. Yes. Yes. Okay. And yours are very similar. I'm going to come to that in a minute and why they're very similar. In my dialect of English, these words are exactly the same. Full and full. I have no distinction whatsoever between them. Okay? While standard American English, and in fact standard British English too, in the South, you're going to have full and full. I'm doing that at the extreme to try and get distinction between it. But there's a few other places, apart from southeast Scotland, that mix them together, and it's Pittsburgh, okay, actually puts them together. And why does Pittsburgh put them together? Because it knows that Scotland's important. No. It's not that. Well, actually, it's not unrelated to that. The first English speakers who lived in Pittsburgh, remember it was French city, and before that it was an Iroquois city, but the first French speakers, the first English speakers who came here were mostly Scottish, because they were miners, okay, because they were coming here to mine the coal, and so many of the early names for places in Pittsburgh and some of the dialect, even though lots of other things have disappeared, are actually Scottish. Hence you think that the full and full are pronounced the same and everybody else thinks that they're pronounced differently. Now, at this point, I point out that I'm a full professor in the university. And I'm now desperately trying to remember who told me that and whether they ever wrote it down or whether they were just telling me that and I misunderstood it. So I don't know which of these two types of professors I actually am. It's up to you to decide which one it is. Okay. So these are the vowels. They're going to be different even in different dialects, as we've been talking about that. I'm now going to talk about the consonants. The consonants are the ones that are not vowels, okay? And there's some semi-vowel things which could be either, depending on who you're talking to, but there's usually we try to give distinctions within languages for that. We've got fairly good definitions of what the space is, although sometimes in languages some people make distinctions and other people don't. But let me talk about these things. Most of the names in English are very cleverly taken so that they are examples of them. So the word stop has got 2 stops in it, so t and p. And they're called stops because you stop the air. So if you think about a t, there's a silent bit before the t, and then there's a burst of air. So it's not a continuous thing that you're saying. What you're doing is when you're speaking and you're saying ATA, and you say a, t, a, okay, a, ta, there's a silence and then there's a t. So it stops, and that's why we call it. Now, where you stop the noise, okay, can vary. You can stop at the lips, okay, so you can say p, okay, with a p at the beginning. You can do it at the teeth, okay, where you can get a t, okay. You can do it up the back of the throat and get a k, okay, and you can do it down the back of the throat and get a h, okay, but we don't have h in standard English. There are other places that people might do in different languages, but there's basically something from the front going all the way down the back of the throat, okay, of how we can actually do stops. There's also a major distinction here between voiced and unvoiced stops, okay. So we have p and b, which is the unvoiced and voiced. We have t and d, which is the unvoiced and voiced, and we have k and g, which is the unvoiced on the roof of the mouth. Now, there are many, many more different variations that actually can happen, okay? And not everybody cares about all of them. Do anybody here from southern China? Yeah. So, below Shanghai is what I'm actually talking about. When you speak Mandarin, you don't care about the voicing, and you will often conflate s and z together. Now, you probably don't think that you do that, but all the people from Beijing here are going, yeah, I know that, that's, yeah, southerner, okay? And that's pretty common, and you're still, you know, your Mandarin's still fully understood by the people in the north, but it's identified as being different. In German, actually, again, the people in the north make distinctions between p and b, but the further you go south, they're less likely to do that. I don't think it's something about how far south it is and how warm it is makes a difference. I don't think there's anything like that, okay? But in different countries, we make different distinctions between these forms. Let's move on to fricatives. Fricatives are things that have got f sound in them. Fricatives means it's got lots of white noise in it, so f and s are examples of fricatives. So again, we have the voiced and unvoiced ones. We have the f and we have the v. We're both doing it through the teeth and the lower lip, okay? And that's a distinction where we voice or not voice. We then have, okay? We don't actually have a voiced version in English, but a number of other languages do. We have s and z. We have sh and zh. And actually, this is where Mandarin Chinese has some other ones that I don't know the difference between. In Romanized form in Chinese, they get written as ZH, Q, and C, and they're apparently different to the Chinese, but to me they sound exactly the same. They're all some form of ch or j, but there's something different that's going on there. Fricatives ch and j in English, which I do distinguish. We have nasals, we have and in English. We don't really have nasalized vowels, but we sometimes do it, and some dialects do more nasalization than others of English. We have glides, we have L and R, and but can be realized in lots of different ways. In fact, it's really quite hard. There's a particular American okay, which is also very northern Chinese. So there is even a technical term for erization or erification in northern Chinese. So let's also talk a little bit about Chinese. If you listen to somebody speaking Mandarin, you can tell whether they come from Taipei or whether they come from Beijing. And one of the key things that allows you to distinguish that is how they say okay? And so it allows, do we have anybody from Taiwan here? Nobody from Taiwan. Whoa. Okay, they must all be on that. Wait, you're from Taiwan, aren't you? No, sorry. That's one way that you can actually distinguish between, because they do something different on how they realize R's. Now, when I realize an R, okay, I like to do the trill, which is the R sound, okay, and I mostly do it, okay, although sometimes it only happens with one trill, which is called a flap, and it can get confused with a D in American English. But the Americans have got a very particular R that it really distinguishes them from most of the other standard English speakers. The Indian R is very different. It's what's called retroflex. The tongue is held a little bit further back, and it's one of the distinctive things that makes it sound Indian. Okay. Now, all of these variations, I've given you prototypical examples, but one, not everybody does it. Even within the same language, not everybody does it. And even within the same language, not everybody does it all the time. It depends how they're actually speaking. Okay? So I already talked about how the R can be redone in different ways. I want to make a little bit of distinction here between phonology and phonemics. So all the noises that we make, people study and try to identify them, but all the noises that are importantly different are really in the phoneme space. They're in the discrete space. But that's a linguistic definition, while people, when they render them, have got a much wider notion of what they're actually going to say. Okay? And somehow when we're listening, we join them together and separate them depending on what people are saying. When you listen to somebody with a different accent who can't distinguish particular things, you learn that they're not going to make distinctions between that, and you can deal with it. Or if they're making more distinctions than you normally would expect them to, you just conflate them because you think, yeah, that's just, they're talking funny. Okay? The language is not the same over time. It will change the more, the longer people speak it. So if you listen to recordings of people speaking 100 years ago, there are recordings, they sound different than what people sound today. Now, one of the things that's happening in American English is there's a new phoneme happening. The Americans don't admit this, but I'll show you that there is. And if you think of the word that the chemical symbol is H2O, I'm deliberately not saying it, okay, then it has a particular American pronunciation that the rest of the English-speaking world does not use. And those of you who learn English later in life, you probably didn't do that. So that's the word water. It has a T in the middle of it. But the Americans don't standardly say that. They actually say water, okay? And so it's no longer a T, it's something else, okay? What they do is, instead of doing a T on their teeth, they take their tongue and they just touch the top of their mouth quickly. It's called a flap, or rather interestingly, a tap, which is something you turn on to get water, okay? They always say it differently. And if you do not do that in American English, okay, when the waiter says to you, what would you like to drink? And you say water, they go, what? Because they can't understand what you say until you say water, okay? So most of you who have come to this country who don't speak standard American have learned to do that automatically because communication fails otherwise, while those of you who grew up here are probably going, yeah, I know it's the word water, but nobody says that unless they come from England or something like that, okay? And that funny thing that happens with the tongue is something that's becoming a phoneme in American English. And 50 years from now, people won't even remember that the word originally was water, I think. Come back and tell me. Well, I won't be here in 50 years, but come back and tell me if I'm wrong. There's other standard things that happen in dialects, and there's also things that happen in particular people's speech, but also people will change how they speak at different times, depending whether they're standing out in front of a class, actually trying to project their voice to the back of the class, than if you're just chatting to your friend. You will change how you actually speak, okay? And so there are some words that are considered to be the same, depending on you, and there's some other forms. We're going to talk about the R deletion. So some accents in North America, particularly in New York and Boston, will delete what's called post-vocalic R's, so the R that comes after a vowel, okay? So Harvard no longer becomes Harvard, but it becomes Harvard, okay? Now, this is because they're mimicking the English, the people from England, okay? They probably don't like to hear that, but that's really what it is. In the south of England, people don't pronounce the post-vocalic R's, so this thing here in standard English is actually an ear. It's not an ear. The R never gets spoken, okay? And you're probably aware of this. That's what you do when you're trying to put on a British English accent. You talk about cars, okay? You don't talk about cars, okay? And it's fine. We're aware of it. And in fact, if you're non-native, you maybe speak English like that, one, because you were taught it, because you were supposed to learn BBC English, and the other one, it's a little easier to do if you don't have post-vocalic R's in your native language. The Japanese, for example, adopt lots of English words into Japanese, but they will typically not pronounce final R's, typically, sometimes they do, because it's just easier to do and they just lengthen the vowel. Okay? What happened to all of these R's? Well, the people in England says we're not going to have them anymore. They put them on a bunch of trains, sent them to Scotland, and we duplicate them. So we always say, you know, around the radical road. So we use multiple ones up. So we're trying to use them up for all the English. Okay? Now, there are other things at the higher level which are to do with word choice, but I'm not talking about word choices. I'm really talking about how we realize these things as actual speech. Okay. So aspirated stops. So I told you that there's things like p, b, t, but we can have distinctions in there, particularly aspirated stops. Do we have any Koreans in the audience? Do we have any Northern Indic speakers? So this is Hindi speakers, Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi. Yes, thank you. Okay, now, do you know what I'm talking about? So imagine that you have a Hindi word for lentils, okay, and it's DHAL, would normally be written in the, imagine there's another word that's DAL, okay? If you were pronouncing them in Hindi, you would pronounce them differently, wouldn't you? So I can never do this very well. So you have lentils, which is dal, and then you have the other one, which is DAL. How would you say that? So you would not aspirate it. I'm going to show for all the English speakers out there, and actually this will probably work for most of you, okay? So I want you to put your hand in front of your mouth, okay? And I want you to say the word pot, okay? Pot. Do you feel your breath on your hand when you do the p? Okay? So that means it's aspirated, so that the p is aspirated. Now, if you say the word spot, the air is no longer there for the p. Where's it gone? Still a p, okay? And the answer is it's a different type of p. It's an unaspirated p. So if you take the word spot and remove the s at the beginning of it, you don't get the word pot. You get the word that's closer to being something like pot. Okay? And that's hard for you to do, because, especially if you're a native speaker, because you never do that. But different languages make distinctions between whether you aspirate or unaspirate. We're probably all aware that the Japanese always make errors about L's and R's and conflate them completely. And I know we have a Japanese speaker in the group. And people think that that's because, you know, they don't care. And it's not that they don't care. Okay, it's actually that they do them all. Okay, and they don't have a distinction between what we in native English speakers distinguish between L and R. But you'll find in different dialects of Japanese that people will do a very wide varieties of L's and R's. They can do them at least perceived as L's and R's, but they're just conflated to the same phoneme within their language. One particular thing I learned when I was in Japan speaking Japanese is you've got to learn not to trill your R's. So you're not supposed to go and ask for ramen. You're supposed to ask for ramen, okay? Because a trilled R is in a particular dialect in Japanese, and that's the Yakuza dialect. And I'm now worried about, was that why people were really polite to me when I was speaking Japanese? Because they thought, oh my God, he's a Yakuza, okay? And it's not as if I've lost one of my fingers or anything, but you know, I don't think they ever thought it was a Yakuza, because it's like, oh my God, this bearded thing, what's this doing here? But anyway, that distinction in Japanese just isn't there, so it's just mixed, okay? But when you're trying to speak it, you have to do something in between that doesn't sound like one or the other, so you have to care about this. Next one, US English. So we have got 3 words here, okay? And I'd like, again, somebody who went to middle school in North America to read out these 3 words.
Mary, Mary, Mary.
Right. So if you went to school in this country, okay, I'm saying school because it's one of the best ways. When you go to middle school, everybody laughs at you if you don't sound the same as everybody else, and it basically causes everybody to have the same dialect. So I'm not saying that, you know, middle school students are really cruel to each other. Well, I am saying that, but it actually causes people to get standardized in what their accent actually is. But standard American, these 3 words, Mary, 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 are all exactly the same. Can I get an Indian to read them out?
Mary, Mary, Mary.
Okay. So in Indian English, there are 3 different vowels. Can't remember the order that I have them in. Same in British English. We have Mary, the girl's name. Okay. We have Mary, as in Christmas. Okay. And we have Mary, as in something to do with weddings. Okay, and they're just 3 different vowels, okay, and they're completely identifiable, okay, and we can't even tell that the Americans can't distinguish them until they start making horrible jokes, okay, that just don't work as puns, because it's like, that's not the same word, okay. However, after you live here for a bit, you end up picking up more and more and more, and I now have another vowel within the 3 that I basically have, which is for American names like Carrie, which is something else, which is closer to what the Americans actually are. I already talked about full and full, pull and pull is the same thing, but that's okay, because I've got some vowels that standard American speakers do not have. In its full form, these 2 words, FOR, FOUR, have completely different vowels in them, for and for. Yes, if you reduce the FOR one to fur with a schwa, then that's different. But in its full form, FOR and FOUR have quite strong distinctions in my dialect. But there are other dimensions that make a difference in speech. It's not just about these phoneme things. What we also have is vowel length. In English, we don't really have vowel length. But bit and beat are arguably an example of vowel length. And if you listen to French speakers of English, they will often conflate them, okay? So if they're asking for a sheet of paper, they might not say sheet, they might say something else. Think about it, okay? Oh, right, yes, the next one. So I lived in Japan. Every morning I'd get up on my way to get the bus to go to work. I'd often meet my neighbour who worked at the same place as me, and she was completely fluent in English. And but I would still greet her in Japanese, and typically ask her about how her husband was, because it's a polite thing to do. So I'd actually say, see if I can get it the right way around, I would actually ask, "Go shujin, do desu ka?" And she would say it's fine, okay? But the word shujin is husband, and the word shujin It's prisoner. Okay? So you want to be very careful about when you're using these words and saying, you know, good morning, how is your honourable prisoner this morning? Okay? It's not the standard way to greet your neighbour. Okay? She also would teach English and she would teach Japanese to foreigners. So she was very conscious of this particular form and commented about this in her class in front of everybody else when she just said, one of my neighbours who is learning Japanese, oops, me, okay. But we don't just have vowel length. A number of languages have vowel length. It's relatively common. Hindi has it. Many of the northern Indic languages have it. German has it. So it's not just Asian languages. Let's talk about tones. Okay. F0, the tune in English and almost all languages, is often used for focus, for phrasing, for joining things together. But in some languages, it's used to give distinctions between actual words. So it's used phonetically, in that a different form means something different. So if you take the word na, ma, and take it in Chinese, there are 4 tones in Chinese. There's a neutral tone as well, but let's only talk about the 4 main tones. And depending on which tone you actually have in Chinese, you get at least mother, horse, okay? And you should be aware of these 2 because you don't ever want to refer to your mother-in-law with the wrong one, okay? If she's Chinese speaking, because it's not going to be very good. So what I'd like is a Mandarin speaker to give me the 4 tones on the syllable ma. Can somebody do that?
Ma, 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 ma.
Okay? These mean something different. Okay? It's not that, yeah, they just sound different about middle of the sentence, end of the sentence. No, they actually mean something completely different. If you get it wrong, okay, your mother gets pissed off because you called her a horse. Okay? Or your horse gets pissed off. Well, that's weird. Let's not do that. Okay? And you have to get it right. And the substantial numbers of people in the Far East actually have it in the language. Korean and Japanese does not, but all of the Sino-Tibetan languages do, and as you move further south. But also Native American languages in the Americas have tones as well, and a number of languages in Africa do. So it's not just the Far East that have it, but of course Chinese is the most famous that has that. There are also clicks, okay, and one of the most famous click-full language is so. Okay, so that X at the beginning is not a ks or a z, but it's an actual. Okay, now z has got 4 different types of clicks. Okay, so there's a 1, there's a 1, and then there's other ones that I can't do. Okay, and actually some of the African languages have even got 6 different types of clicks. If you can tell the difference. But they can, and it's really important, and it's really weird when you're listening to it, because when you're listening, you think, wait, what was that click? Okay? Because it just doesn't seem to fit in, because you're not used to it actually being part of the language. Most languages, when they're speaking, blow the air out. Only rarely are you sucking air in. The clicks are one of the rare examples, but there's a few other ones that do it as well. Okay, so that's the phonetic part. I'd like to move on to intonation, because it's not just that speech is about what the phonetic words are, it's actually also about how you say them, okay? And I'm first going to talk a little bit about tune, okay? And when I say tune, I really mean the thing you use when you're singing, okay? But we do this when we're speaking. I'm going to show you an example here. So here is what's called the F0 of a particular piece of speech. So what we do is we measure on the larynx, okay? We can do this on the speech as it comes out. We don't have to put pins in somebody's throat to do this, although we used to do that. And so what we do is we measure how often this is happening every second, and then we plot the frequency of it over time. And so if you plot somebody's speaking over time, you get a graph something like this, okay? The words are written along the bottom, okay? Now, in general, female speech has got higher F0 than male speech. Okay? And the reason for this is that when boys reach puberty, their larynx, Adam's apple, actually drops further down their throat, and so the length of their vocal tract, of male vocal tract, is usually longer than the length of the female vocal tract. And therefore it makes it much easier, you can still control it, much easier that the bass pitch for males is probably going to be a lower pitch than what it's going to be for females. Okay? There's also a social aspect to it, that there's an expectation that males have a deeper voice and females have a higher voice, and that's been in their cultures, all of our cultures, for a long time. And it might even be older than humans, that the expectation of this. If you think about it, that big animals will have long vocal tracts, and therefore usually their pitch is going to be lower, and little animals have got smaller pitch, and therefore vocal tracts, and therefore the pitch is going to be higher. So you think elephants versus mice. And in general, if something comes with a big deep voice and says, hello, and people are frightened, okay, while if something comes with a little high-pitched voice, people are not frightened, maybe, okay? Therefore, I don't quite get the therefore, there is a feeling that perhaps from a social point of view, there's a higher pitched female voice than a male voice. There's good physiological reasons for it, but you get a lot of choice of where your pitch actually is. In general, male pitch is probably going to be about 100 times a second, plus or minus 30 or 40, and in general, female is going to be something like about 160, 170, plus or minus about 40, in general. But there are exceptions. For example, in the United States, because this country has got equal opportunities for men and women. No, you didn't get that joke. Okay. We would like to think that it's got equal opportunities for men and women. And compared to some countries, it certainly does, okay, but it's definitely not equal. But in the US, women's voices are typically, they are speaking at the lower end of their pitch range. So they're typically got a lower pitch than what women may have naturally in some other language. For example, in Japanese, it's been considered that women should have high-pitched voices, so they in general have a higher-pitched voice than maybe what their natural pitch would be. And if you find bilingual American Japanese speakers and you ask them to speak either language, you'll notice that their English is much lower pitch than their Japanese, even though they're using the same vocal tract to actually generate it. In fact, in the US, the pitch of women is now so low, or the expected pitch of women is so low, they're at the bottom of their pitch range, and they end up not being able to fully support their pitch all the time, and they end up with something that's called creaky voice, okay? I can't do it, okay? Well, actually, I can do it at 6 a.m. before I've drunk my coffee. Men do it too, we're at the bottom of the range, but if you search on YouTube for creaky voice, you'll get to hear lots of examples of it, and as soon as you hear it, go, yeah, that's an American speaking, okay? And it becomes very noticeable. I always associate it with younger American women, because the older women don't do it as much, but now that I'm old, that's not really the case. Everybody does it, and so I won't pick on any of the American women in the audience to just get them to say anything, because they almost certainly do it. Okay? Anyway, back to this. So we have a pitch range here that starts at 300. That's pretty high for a male, so I think this is a female speaking. Okay? But at the end, it goes down to 100. That's pretty low for a woman, so it's an American woman speaking. And in fact, I'll even go further than that. It's not just an American woman speaking, but it's actually an authoritative American woman, because supposedly the lower the pitch, the more authoritative you have. Remember, the elephant can tell people to leave, while the mouse cannot. Or, well, they can both tell you to leave, but you believe the elephant, you don't believe the mouse. Okay? The lower the pitch, the more authoritative, and we have that view. Newsreaders are usually got a lower pitch, even the men. Okay, so this is an American female newsreader speaking, just on the pitch. And actually, I can go more than that. And so if actually look, it says, Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission. See the bump that's over the word finance? Okay. She's focusing that. She's telling you that the word finance is important. But she's also telling you that the word Boston is not important. Boston is already part of the discourse. It's already been introduced or assumed. Okay? So she doesn't say Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission. She says Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission. Okay? And that means that she's from Boston. She's an American female newsreader from Boston. Okay? Because she's not focusing Boston, and so Boston has to already be part of the conversation, and she's talking about the Finance Commission. So let me play this.
Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission, a watchdog agency created by the city charter.
She's got creaky voice at the end. And I'm right, okay? She is an American female newsreader from Boston, WBUR, which is one of the NPR stations. Did I really get that from the F-Zero? And the answer is no, because I know that she's an American female newsreader. But I am absolutely right that these things about how she speaks is because she's an American female newsreader in Boston. Okay? So that information is in the speech, and if she did something that was different from that, that didn't match the background, it would surprise you. Okay? And you would get confused. It's like, why is this person talking like this? Or this person isn't native, or this person doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay. Remember that when we're dealing with text, we think that words are the definitions of the things that have got spaces round about them. Okay? Yes, I know all you Chinese and Thai people in the audience are going, wait, what, spaces? No. Chinese doesn't have spaces between it, so you have to find out where these things actually are. And people are somewhat surprised that they've never seen that before, because it's like, how the hell do you know what the words are if you don't have spaces between it? You know, English has spaces between it, we always have spaces between it. Well, in speech, you don't have spaces between words. We do not put little pauses between each word. Okay, we just mush them all together, and yet we know what words are. Okay, that's the same thing that's happening in Chinese and Thai and Japanese. Okay, we also have to be aware that the word meaning isn't always the right meaning. We talked about this before, and so you have to be aware that "can you pass the salt" is actually a specific request to pass the salt, rather than a question about ability of your capability of passing salt. You can say Boston in lots of different ways, depending on the context that you're actually in. And yeah, right. Doesn't always mean positive things. It can mean quite negative things. Sarcasm is very powerful. Okay. I'm going to skip the next bit because I want to make sure that I get this important as well. Speech recognition. So how do we deal with all this noise in speech recognition? So what we need to do is we have to build what's called an acoustic model, where we have to try to model all of the different ways everybody in every context might say every phoneme. Okay? And so we need training data for this. And so we need lots of examples. Okay? So we need lots of examples how everybody says ah in context. So we want to know whether it's a sit before and a t afterwards and sat. Okay, and we want to know when it's a bit first and a t afterward back. And so we want to collect lots of people. And we want to get it from as many different people as possible, and maybe even in many different acoustic environments as possible. But ultimately, we want, given the acoustic string, we want to say, we think this is an ah, I think this is a bit. It could be a p, because they're quite hard to distinguish and they sort of overlap. Can overlap as well. They're not always fully identified. But in addition to that, we also want to know what are the likely language sequences. We already know about language models, and actually it's pretty hard to try to understand a language where you've just got the acoustics and you don't know the language. Okay? So if I say something to you like Nihongo dekimasu ka, If you don't know Japanese, that sentence is incredibly hard to get anything wrong. If I asked you to write that down in a Romanized form, you'd find that hard to do, unless you know Japanese, because then you just write it down. But because most of you, I assume, do not know Japanese, then you don't know what the syllable structure is, you don't know what the likely words are, and therefore you can't actually do it. So in English, the same problem is there when I ask you to write down the following sentence, window the in dog that is much higher. Like, wait, what? Some dog windowed something, and I don't know what he said. Because what I did was I took how much is the dog in the window and said it backwards, window the in dog that is much higher. And because I'm not following the normal language model rules, it's really hard to remember it. Okay, so we, as humans, when we're learning a language, have got both the acoustic variation, but we also have the language model of the expected form. When you learn a language, you're probably aware to begin with, it was very hard to recognize when somebody said something to you in the language you didn't know. But as you got better at the language, you got much better at listening to it and going, yeah, that word and that word I don't know, but the other ones I do. Okay, you could actually identify. Well, you know, the first time that happened, it was like, I don't know, it was a string of word soup. I had no way to separate it, even though you might have known some of the words that were actually in it. So in speech recognition, we have an acoustic model and we have a language model, and we use both of them together to be able to try to work out what's actually going on and caring about the most frequent things. But in speech recognition, the accuracy of speech recognition varies not just with the language that people are saying, but also with the speaker language dialects. So who is saying it? Some people are clearer than others, and if that person's not in your training set, or somebody like that is not in your training set, can be actually hard. The language, some languages are easier than others, and if you're non-native, that also makes a difference. Dialect, if you trained everything on standard Southern English, and then all of a sudden you moved and tried to recognize Americans have got this extra R, and so everything will stop working if you're doing it. The microphone type makes a difference. If you have the microphone here, then it's relatively easy. If the microphone is sitting on the table, every time I turn away, the acoustics will actually change pretty drastically. Your ear doesn't care, okay, but the speech recognition really cares, okay, and so that makes a difference. Speaking style makes a difference. If I'm talking to everybody in the room, I speak in a different way than if I'm talking to somebody who's just standing next to me, and that makes a difference. Good recognition, if you have a head-mounted mic, a controlled language, so there's only limited things you can say, you know, like next slide please, and it goes on to the next slide, okay, and a careful speaker. Professor Alex Weibel, who's a professor here in language technologies, has been working on speech recognition for most of his research life, and it's gone as far as affecting his speech. He now speaks really fluently. He almost never makes speaking errors because he's had to speak to speech recognition systems all of his life, and therefore he always speaks fluently. It's really quite fun listening to him once you notice it, because you think, this is weird. Oh no, it isn't. He's a really good speaker, but it is weird that he doesn't make speech errors anymore because he's done too much speech recognition demos. A not so good recognition would be a remote mic. If there are chatting between friends, if there are other people chatting around, because that means there's lots more very similar acoustics that can actually mix things up. Outside with a brass band playing and cars going by, all of that to make it much harder. Now, if you think about it, if you're in a loud bar and there's background music and lots of other people speaking, it's harder to understand the other people speaking. If you're non-native, you'll know this immediately. You go to a bar and it's like, I can't speak this language anymore. Just have a few drinks and after that you can speak the language and it's okay. But actually you can't hear what the other person is saying because it's harder. And this is true for machines as well. This formula should be recognizable to you. This is the noisy channel. We use it in speech recognition as well. What we care about here O is the observation, which is the acoustics. W is the words, it's the language model. And what we do is we separate it with Bayes' rule, so that instead of doing the probability of the words given the observation, we separate it out in the probability of the Always make sure you get it around that way. Observations given the words, multiply the probability of the words. You're trying to find the most probable form of that, but you've got this separate language model that you can train on other data. That's a great thing, okay? You're doing it with some HMMs or maybe neural form, and then you've got an independent language model that's caring about it, and that's how we do speech recognition. Let's talk about speech synthesis. There's a bit I want to get onto before we end today. So speech synthesis is the generation. There are three parts. There's a linguistic analysis of the text itself, there's getting the prosody and pronunciation, and then there's the actual generation of the waveform file. Okay? Let's see a little bit about the text analysis. So it uses many of the techniques that we're talking about. One of the things, if you look at the second sentence on there, it's got the word spelled L-I-V-E-S. The second one, okay, and it's pronounced differently. My cat, who lives dangerously, has 9 lives. Because the first one, okay, is a verb, and the last one is a noun. And native speakers know that, and they do it without thinking. Non-native speakers, well, it depends how non-native you are, become aware of that and going, shit, I have to know what the part of speech tag is in order to be able to get the pronunciation. And so you do. So in text-to-speech, we have to know what the part of speech tag is because it's going to change what the pronunciation is. In fact, there's a whole class of words in English that have different pronunciation depending on whether they're a noun or a verb. Okay? 2-syllable verbs like project is a verb, while project is a noun. Okay? And there's segment, convict, convict. There's a whole bunch of them. Okay? And you've got to get these things right, otherwise people laugh at your synthesizer for getting it wrong. You stole $100 from the bank. Well, it's not $100, it's $100. Okay? And so, how do you get the pronunciation of the numbers? You have to have some wee set of rules to be able to work out how to do that. But we can do that. We can write something to do that. Let's look at the next one. He stole 1,900, possibly and or not, 96 cattle on the 25th. Okay, it's an ordinal, it's not a cardinal. November, not Nov. Okay, 1996. We don't say in the year of our Lord 1996. It's incredibly archaic to say something like that. We have a way of saying years that's different from saying quantities. So you have to know whether the number is a quantity, or it's a year, or it's a street number. Street numbers and years are almost pronounced the same, although it's not clear. I remember when we started doing this in the 1990s, nobody knew how the years were going to be pronounced from 2000 onwards. They genuinely didn't know, because we didn't know what we were going to do. Okay? Next one, that's okay. He stole $100. We know how to say that, so we stole $100 million from the bank. Oh no, wait, no, the million's in the wrong place. Okay, the million goes before the word dollar. Wait, what? So he stole $1 million from the bank. So you have to know what the following alien word is in order to be able to pronounce it properly. So we can do stuff, but we have to know about these things to get them right. I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time. But yeah, other hard ones, and you have to work out good and efficient ways of actually doing this. I'm going to give you, this is the last thing that I want to do today, I'm going to give you some examples of previous synthesizers, and so you can actually hear what their distinctions actually are. So the first one is really how speech synthesis was done in the 1970s and 80s, but this particular voice is very famous, and I'm sure you've heard it before.
Ferment synthesis is an older technology, most famously in talk, that produces understandable synthesis, but is not so natural. It is, however, quite suitable for discussing the beginning of time and black holes.
So that is actually Stephen Hawking's voice, okay? The actual professor of physics from Cambridge University who died a few years ago. When I say it's actually his voice, it wasn't that I went to him and said, could you record some example of your voice so we can actually get it? I'd say it's actually his voice because they sent me the box that he uses to speak. He had 2 of them. And they sent one of them to me and said, please build a synthesizer from this box so that we have something that's software only rather than this physical box from 1983 that's probably going to catch fire. Okay, we did not make it catch fire. It wasn't us, it was somebody else. But we took recordings from that, and I recorded some specific things for my classes in the future from it. And then we built a software-based version of the synthesizer. Now, it was originally a software system, okay? And it was built into hardware because that's how you built things back in the early 1980s. And there's a few people I know who actually worked on the original system, including Alex Weigel, who I mentioned earlier. He was an undergrad with Dennis Cladd, who developed it. Now, that synthesizer is understandable, but it's unquestionably a robot or a Nobel Prize winning physicist speaking. So it's one of those, okay? But it's not natural speech. And many people over the years tried to provide a much more natural voice for Stephen Hawking, but he absolutely didn't want it because that's his voice. Now, that's the thing that he used for most of his life, actually, since the 1980s. But that technology is not wonderful, and it's actually constructed by a bunch of rules, and it's quite impressive that it works at all, and people quickly realize that's not actually what they want, and what they would really like is something more natural. So maybe what we should do is we should record people's voices, and then we'll take the words that they say, and then we'll stuff them together and get them to speak more clearly. So that's what this next one is.
Laurence Olivier for Diet Coke.
Hello, I'm Laurence Olivier. I've been
Dead for over 2 years.
now, but through the marvelous technology of ape editing, I'm able to speak to you from beyond the grave. What you are listening to right now
It was made by
cutting together things I said in my many films and interviews. Although I never would have endorsed a product like this when I was alive, my estate has determined that if I was alive, I would really want to tell you how much I enjoy the taste of Diet Coke. I think
I did not make that. I don't know who did make it, but I know most people in speech synthesis use that example because it highlights lots of the issues. So the recordings were taken from different farms, many different films and interviews, he says, and so there's different acoustic patterns that are going on, and you can tell, you can hear where the joins are between the different farms. When you get a repeat word, when he says, alive, he says it exactly the same way, and that's just not natural. That's not, people never say things the same way, so that should not be the case. And when you have out of vocabulary words like Diet Coca-Cola, they've got to be pieced together with little pieces of speech, and it sucks, okay? So that's not the right way of doing it, but it's definitely, it's more entertaining than Stephen Hawking, but it's more natural, but wrong. So maybe what we could do is we could go and get the speaker, stuff them in a little room and say, you're going to say all of the phonemes once and only once, okay? And then we're going to take these phonemes and then we're going to join them together. So we have a sentence which allows us to get all the phonemes once and only once. The sentence is, a whole joy was reaping, but they've gone south, you should fetch Azure Mike. So that's the Quick Brown Fox jumps over the lazy dog, which has got all the letters of the alphabet once in it, but there's got all the phonemes of American English in it once, and only once, okay? I always would like to thank US Air and Chicago Airport for trapping me there for 4 hours while I discovered that sentence by searching through the lexicon, okay? So what we did was we recorded that. This is actually me speaking, and then we took the phonemes and put them together, okay? And now we get a synthesizer from this. So, are you ready? What does this say?
This is a sample.
What did it say? Something, something. This is something, something, something. So it's incredibly hard to understand. Okay. So what I'm going to tell you what it says. It says this is a short example. Okay, but all the phonemes are the same length. Okay, so there's no modification on the length of the phoneme, and therefore it says this is a short example. Okay, so now listen to it.
This is a short example.
Now you can understand what it says. So I can build a synthesizer as long as I tell you what it's going to say, you know what it's going to say. That's not really what we should be doing in speech synthesis. And therefore, we should not be taking isolated phonemes. That's wrong. If you think about how phonemes work, it's all to do with the transitions. It's not to do with the actual phonemes themselves. When you join phonemes together, there's co-articulation things that happen and the phonemes round about them. And so maybe we shouldn't do all the phonemes, but we should do all the transitions between phonemes. These are called diphones. There are about 45 phonemes in American English, depending how you count. And so 45 times 45, it's about 1,500. And so we would record 1,500 different sounds out of somebody, and then we could put these together. And then we could do more, because we could actually vary the pitch and duration, so we don't just get this monotone form coming out. So here's an example where we've done transitions between different phones.
This is a short introduction to the Festival Speech Synthesis System.
This is much more natural, and that's how most speech synthesizers were from the 90s and actually well into the 2000s. I'm talking about Apple there, they were a little late to change. But it's still not as natural as what we'd like. We've still got one example of each transition, so t to ah, b to ah, m to ah, n to ah. So we've got all of those that we record, and we get somebody to actually record these. And so what we could actually do is have a much more natural data set and find appropriate examples in that and join them together, so we get something like this.
This was a short introduction to the Festival Speech Synthesis System.
So we've already gone to much more natural. This is what's called unit selection synthesis. It was all the rage from about 1995 to maybe as late as the past 2010. It was good if you had the examples in the data set, and if you didn't have examples in the data set, it really sucked. So it'd be really fluent and then say something stupid, or it'd be really hard to understand. But if you designed your data set right, it would be good. Or if you controlled what was actually spoken, it would actually be quite good. And about that time, an alternative came along that instead of taking isolated pieces of speech and joining them together, what it did, it found similar pieces of speech and averaged them. This had the advantage that instead of needing 20 hours of speech from somebody to be able to build you could get away with maybe getting about 10 minutes of speech, and you could get a synthesizer out of them. So here's an example of this, again using one of our systems.
This is a short introduction to the Festival Speech Synthesis System.
Sorry, that's a unit selection one with some errors in it. Here's the averaged one.
This is an example of ClusterGen, a statistical parametric synthesizer trained from the same 1,100 Arctic utterances.
So that's one of our graduate students. There's about an hour of speech that we recorded from her, and we get a fairly high quality synthesizer out of her. But if we'd recorded her for 20 hours and got her to stay in domain, it would be better. So you have a choice. I'll be in domain, I'll record 20 hours and it can be really good, or I can be something that'll be pretty good, but maybe not wonderful all the time. And you have a choice about how to be able to do that. And then, of course, nowadays, people move into the neural space, and neural has got a little bit of advantage of both. When it's good, it's really good, and it sounds like the unit selection voices. The unit selection voices sound like pre-recorded speech when they're good. You can't really distinguish between them. But WaveNet, that came out of DeepMind and Google 2016, gives pretty high quality speech and gives you much more control over the speech itself, so that you can do some of the things you can do with the statistical parametric synthesis. And so synthesis nowadays is using this technology.
The Blue Lagoon is a 1980 American romance and adventure film directed by Randall Kleiser.
Now, when they first did this, they're doing really interesting things about prediction. They're actually predicting every single sample, so they're predicting 16,000 things per second. And they train this over a large amount of data, 35 hours, what they were training for. And when they first announced this, I asked them how much CPU time did they need to train it, okay? And the answer was Europe. That's not an answer to how much CPU time. Well, it is if you work with Google, because they section all of their cloud servers by continent, okay? And what they mean was they used all of Google's processors in Europe to be able to do the training, okay? That's a lot, okay? That's more than most of us have access to. Nowadays, we can train this much faster, and it can be trained in a few days on a reasonable GPU. So we don't actually need, 100,000 GPUs to be able to do it. We're actually much better. But it still takes a long time to train, and it still is what's in the data set. It's not actually what's, you don't get full control over the person's. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'll continue on Thursday. Okay, thank you.